everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History of podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Thomas Schmidt. And today we're going to be talking about, did Josephus mention Jesus Christ? I had a link to purchase Thomas's book in the description below, but also there's a link there to get yourself a free PDF copy if you don't want to buy the book. It's called Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. And with that being said, Thomas, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jacob. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. I will be going through some parts of the book during this stream, but before I do, can you tell the audience a little bit about what led you into suggesting that the testimonium is largely authentic? What is the consensus view on the testimonium right now? And what does your analysis bring to the table?
About 100 years ago, the consensus was that it was forged or at least heavily interpolated. But then there was a scholar, Henry Thackeray. He's a great Josephine scholar. He translated much of the volumes of Josephus's Antiquities for the Loeb Classical Library translation. He also agreed with that, but then in his work, he changed his mind. He thought that there were just so many stylistic parallels between the passage about Jesus called the Testimonium Flavianum, the testimony of Flavius Josephus, and the rest of Josephus's works. And that shifted the field so that increasingly scholars have thought that the passage was authentic, that Josephus said something similar to the passage, but that there had been alterations or interpolations made by Christian scribes, and scholars wavered generally between significant changes to minor changes. And I got into this because, I mean, Josephus is a fascinating person. He witnesses to all sorts of events and people found in the New Testament, early Judaism, things like that. So I got into this. I started writing a paper on the Arabic and Syriac versions of this paragraph. And I thought maybe those preserved a more authentic version than the original Greek manuscripts that we have. But I came to change my mind. And that's because I started using these relatively new, they're new by scholarly standards, databases. They've been around for a couple decades, but these databases of Josephus's works. And I was able to search very systematically and comprehensively and note even more parallels, more stylistic parallels in terms of grammar, phrasing, verbiage, things like that between the paragraph and other aspects of Josephus, other things that he says, so much so that it just seems impossible for this to be a wholesale forgery. And not only that, it's not just the parallels, it's what the parallels reveal, because they reveal that those statements that are often translated so fantastically positively about Jesus are really much more ambiguous, potentially skeptical on the side of Josephus. So, in other words, it looks like the passage is authentic. I don't see, when you just do normal textual criticism, when you look at all the textual witnesses, you look at what they say, and you look at how those words and phrases are used by the author elsewhere, it looks authentic to me.
I'm going to zoom in real quick here. So I want to start here where you talk about the pattern, this pattern of neglecting or ignoring the apparently pro-Christian claims of the TF continues with Eusebius. So can you expand on what you're talking about here?
That's in chapter 1 of my book. So chapter 1 isn't even really about the style of the Testimonium Flavianum. It's a study on how Greek authors interpreted the Testimonium Flavianum. One question that's always important to ask when you're trying to interpret an ancient text is, how did other ancient writers interpret that text? So I try to do an exhaustive study where I find about 20 times, and I attempt this to be as comprehensive as possible, 20 times where Greek authors quote from or discuss the Testimonium Flavianum, and I look at what they say. And the first person to quote the Testimonium Flavianum is Eusebius of Caesarea. He quotes it around 313 in his Ecclesiastical History, but he quotes it 2 more times in his Theophany and in his Demonstration. He also revised his Ecclesiastical History. He issued several editions, so he had opportunities to revise what he said about the Testimonium Flavianum, but he doesn't seem to have altered it. And the remarkable thing is that he quotes this passage 3 times, but he never seems to point out all of the suspicious things that scholars see in the passage today, even though he just quoted them. So, for instance, scholars will typically interpret the passage as saying that Jesus was raised from the dead, he was the Christ, he fulfilled Jewish prophecy. Eusebius doesn't mention any of that. He instead just focuses on really mundane stuff like the chronology and the number of Jesus's disciples. And you see that pattern continue with other Greek authors. They do pretty much the same thing by and large. Some of them get very excited about it. On the page that you have on there right now, Isidore of Pelusium, he's really enthusiastic about it, but he simply just notes that he's especially amazed about how Jesus was said to be a teacher who received truths of people who received truths with pleasure. He doesn't point out all of the much more fantastic claims. And that pattern just continues with Oecumenius and with other folks, most of whom quote the entire paragraph. So we know they're looking at the same passage we have today. And that's one thing that got me thinking, maybe we scholars have been misinterpreting what is meant by this passage.
In the next page after this one, you talk about George the monk.
Mm-hmm.
What does he say about Josephus regarding John the Baptist and Jesus?
He talks about Jesus and John the Baptist, and it's a little hard to suss out what George is trying to get at, and that alone is noteworthy, because you would think with such a allegedly fantastic passage, it would be very easy to point out why Jesus was such a big deal and why he fulfilled Jewish prophecy and things. But instead, he kind of descends into this discussion about John the Baptist versus Jesus, and how according to George the monk, he says some anti-Semitic things about the crack-brained Jews say John is better than Jesus for the following reasons, and it almost seems like George thinks that Josephus thinks that John the Baptist is better than Jesus. And when you look at what Josephus says about John, he actually says some very, very explicitly positive things about John that you really can't interpret any other way than Josephus liking John. He thought John was a good guy. But with Jesus, it's I think much more ambiguous. It's not entirely clear what Josephus thought, and I think George is picking up on that.
So now I'm going to go to
one caution I want to make with this, Jacob, is that I do say this in my book, is that some of these little case studies, you can argue along alternative lines. You can come up with reasons why, author A or author B he may have quoted the whole passage, but then not pointed out the amazing things. So my argument is a cumulative one, where it's not just that one person does it, it's that it just keeps happening again and again. And that pattern is suggestive that these authors are picking up something that we are missing.
Can you tell us a little bit about Theodoret, and what does he say when he quotes from Josephus' Antiquities for his commentary on Daniel? And did he have access to multiple different versions of the testimonium?
Right. This is a section in the same chapter where I moved from looking at how authors who quoted the Testimonium Flavianum, or a few of them only paraphrase it, how they treat it, and I moved to looking at those authors who don't talk about it, but whom we know knew about it. And the reason why we know they knew about it is because they interact very heavily with the works of Eusebius of Caesarea, who quotes from it 3 times. Here we have Theodoret. He's a very famous, highly educated 5th century Christian author, and he quotes from Josephus's Antiquities many times. He also quotes from Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History. Theodoret was a historian himself. He also quotes from Eusebius's Demonstration. So he has at least 2, maybe 3 copies of the Testimonium Flavianum, But I say right there that Theodoret says that Josephus, quote, did not accept the Christian message, which means that he doesn't seem to be interpreting the Testimonium Flavianum the way we do. And again, if it was just this one individual, Theodoret, you could chalk that up as a data outlier. Every set of data is going to have outliers. But increasingly, this is becoming the norm with authors who treat the Testimonium Flavianum. If you go to the next page, you'll see that I give several other authors who do similar things. I think I have the Paschal Chronicle on there. Yeah, the Paschal Chronicle, and then George Synkelus. These are chronological works that are using Eusebius, and they also quote from Josephus many times. They quote from Eusebius many times. And when they come to that portion of history about Pontius Pilate, they just don't say anything about the Testimonium Flavianum, despite sometimes, like George Synkelus, he quotes Josephus on John the Baptist, quotes him on James, the brother of Jesus, these other famous paragraphs. We know he knows about the Testimonium Flavianum because he uses heavily the ecclesiastical history of Eusebius, yet he doesn't quote from it. And it doesn't seem to be that he was suspicious over its authenticity, because he, like other people elsewhere in his works, will say they'll mischaracterize Josephus terribly. They'll distort what he has to say. So that it doesn't seem like they were really concerned about accuracy. At least George Synkelus wasn't, but he doesn't quote from it. And what the most reasonable explanation for this is that he just didn't think it was that remarkable. It didn't serve his arguments very well, so he just moved on.
All right, so now I want to really get into the weeds of it. I'm going to go to page 49, where you talk about the Arabic testimonium.
Yeah. That's what got me interested in this whole project. Yeah, there we are.
Yeah. All right. So tell us about this, Agapius and the Arabic Testimonium Flavianum.
Yeah, this is fascinating. In the 70s, and a scholar noticed that there was a version of the Testimonium Flavianum found in an Arabic Christian historian named Agapius of Manbij, and that this particular Arabic version did not sound nearly as positive as the Greek version sounded. And he wrote a small book on this, and this is Shlomo Pinesh, and he theorized that the Arabic more accurately preserves the Greek. This is not as an extraordinary or unusual argument as you might think. Agapius is laboring at a time when there's this massive translation movement where both Christian and Islamic scholars are translating the Greek classics, especially scientific literature and medical literature and philosophical literature, into Arabic. And there are times when the Arabic preserves lost Greek works. There's also times when the Arabic can help us correct later Greek manuscripts because the Arabic comes from a purer or more accurate manuscript line. So this isn't an absurd notion. It's possible. And I thought it was very intriguing. And if you look at the Arabic and you read it, you'll see that he doesn't, in the Arabic, Agapius does not present Josephus as saying that Jesus was risen from the dead. He actually says they reported that he appeared to them after 3 days. It doesn't say that he was the Christ. He says perhaps he was the Christ. So it goes from a definite to a hypothetical. And it seems reasonable that maybe this is preserving a more authentic variant. What even seems more reasonable is that when you read Agapius, he is actually a terrible historian, but his inaccuracy lurches in a definite pro-Christian and anti-Jewish way. He's always distorting sources to make Christians look better and Jews look worse, and Christians do more miraculous things and Jews do terrible things. But here, that doesn't seem to be happening. Here, he has this opportunity to present the Testimonium Flavianum in a way that is fantastically pro-Christian, to parade it around like he normally does against his Jewish interlocutors, but he doesn't. And it's very telling. So in my book, I look at that. I actually think that this isn't the greatest preservation of the Testimonium Flavianum. I think what's going on here, and I can go into details if you want, but just to
Yeah.
briefly summarize, is that he's actually using a Syriac translation that we have, and that this Syriac translation lacks much of the it doesn't clearly state all these fabulously positive things about Jesus. So Agapius is just going off of that. And I think the Syriac Forlaga, the Syriac base that Agapius is working off of, is much more interesting. And I talk about that later in the chapter, where I think this was done by Jacob of Edessa, the Syriac translation, and it was finished around 700 AD. And in this particular version, I think it's a few pages down. Yep, there we go. And in this particular version, this is a much more faithful translation of the Greek. And in this particular version, it says not that Jesus was the Christ, but that it was thought that he was the Christ. And the fascinating aspect of that is that this matches what Jerome in 393 AD, it matches his Latin translation of the Testimonium Flavianum, where he says Jesus was believed to be the Christ. So you have this coinciding nature of these two translations, the Syriac and the Latin, which could not have been copying off of one another. And they suggest that the Greek manuscripts they had before them of Josephus's works said that Jesus was only somehow considered to be the Christ.
So, is there a direct relationship between this Syriac recension and the Arabic one, or are they working from a common test? Are they working from the same testimonium and looking at it a little differently?
We can't be 100% sure about that. So it's possible that they are working off of a common source. They're not sharing a source, but they're working off of the Greek. They could be working off a mutual Greek manuscript. I don't think so. I think that what we have is it's a little complicated, but what we have is this Arabic by Agapius. We have this Syriac that's preserved by Michael the Syrian, but the Syriac is much more accurate. We know that the Syriac couldn't be translating the Arabic because it's much more accurate than the Arabic. The Arabic can't be translating the Syriac because it's written before Michael's work. And if you read Michael's work, he's pretty clear that his source is Jacob of Edessa. And we also note that Michael, the Syriac author, and Agapius, the Arabic author, they present the same series of stories in the same exact sequence. So they're clearly working off of some kind of shared source. And the simplest explanation is they're both working off of Jacob of Edessa. Michael is borrowing Jacob wholesale, which he says he did. He said he wholesale incorporated Jacob's work into his work. The alternative explanation is possible, which you have just suggested, that perhaps they aren't working off of Jacob. Maybe Michael worked off of Jacob and Agapius was working off some other Greek thing. That is possible.
So now I'm going to shift to page 63. This is actually, I want to ask you about this real quick before I go all the way over there. When you talk about Michael's record of times, and he talks about Jacob and some of the years from Adam, what is the connection here with the testimonium? What's the link that you're trying to make here?
This is showing scholars have been, the field of Syriac studies is not nearly as well tilled as the field of Greek or Latin studies. So there's still much to be discovered. And Michael wrote this huge chronicle of world history. And scholars have debated what his sources were for various points of his chronicle. And what I'm doing here in this page is I'm trying to argue what his sources were, because it turns out that he actually tells us. If you read the beginning of his chronicle, he says, as you see in that quoted paragraph, that this chronicle, which is Michael's record of the times, has been collected laboriously and distinctly from various chroniclers. And he says, especially from the works of Abbas Mar Jacob of Edessa, whose entire chronicle we inserted here. And that does leave, if we only had that paragraph, we would suspect Jacob as a primary source, but perhaps not the only source. But there's another area where Michael talks about his sources and he lists them. And Jacob is the only one that covered the time frame at hand. He's the only one that would have covered the time frame of the time of Jesus and the governorship of Pontius Pilate. And so that makes Jacob, a prime target for the source material. There's another piece of evidence for Jacob is that we do have some fragments of his chronicle, and when you compare those fragments with Michael's chronicle, they're almost verbatim the same. So it looks like the first portion of Michael's chronicle, he just used Jacob wholesale and then moved on. And that's where my argument that the Syriac version is probably from Jacob of Edessa around 700 AD.
All right, so now I'm going to move to the authorial commentary real quick.
This is chapter 3, right? Yeah.
Yeah, looks like I'm already there now. Yep. You mentioned that Jacob's described by Michael as using both Josephus and Eusebius as sources.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expand? Tell us a little bit more about what's going on there.
Jacob was a remarkable individual. Some people say he was the most educated person in the world in 700 AD, and it's a fair argument. He was one of those polymaths who kind of did everything: theology, philosophy, translation work. So we know from his chronicle or from what remains of his chronicle, that he used Eusebius of Caesarea, but he also used Josephus. And we know that because he preserves quotations of Josephus that are not in Eusebius's chronicle. We also know that, or Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, or anywhere else by Eusebius. So we know that Jacob also read Greek. We know he did translations. We also know that he had a habit of taking previous translations of Greek works into Syriac and revising them against the original Greek. And so I argue that what's happening here is that Jacob, when he is crafting his chronicle, he's taking Eusebius's historical works that are in Greek, and he is translating them into Syriac. But some of Eusebius's works have already been translated into Syriac, so he's borrowing from those, but he's also going to original Greek sources. And again, this isn't just simple speculation, because we know he did that in other times, and we also know he did that specifically with Josephus, because he has these quotations that are found nowhere else in Syriac literature or in Eusebius's works. So my theory is that he was using both the antiquities of Josephus and Eusebius and revising or creating this Syriac translation. This argument, I think, is a good one, but it's not necessary for the overall theory. I mean, he could have, just used Eusebius, or he could have used some other Syriac translation. The fact remains is that whatever he's using preserves this apparently much more authentic reading of the Testimonium Flavianum, where Jesus, instead of being the Christ, is only thought to be the Christ. And that parallels Jerome writing in Latin, whom Jacob could never have used for his research.
All right, now I want to get to the part where you mention was the Christ. That's one of the big things.
Yeah, that's going to be far down below.
Yeah, I'm going to page 83.
Okay.
I'm almost there.
And just so I think you mentioned it earlier, but people can get this PDF for free due to a really
Yeah.
generous donor.
Yeah. So link to that's in the description below. And just to be specific, it's in the academic.oup.com link. You'll see that right on the top of the description below. It will also be in the pinned comment after the live stream. So it'll be very, very easily found. All right. So many will say, as you know, oh, Christos hutos in. There's no way Jesus wrote. There's no way Josephus wrote that. I mean, come on, he was the Christ. But you make a very good point here that I would like you to discuss. That just because somebody says Prophet Muhammad, for instance, or to talk about the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, doesn't really mean that person is saying it the same way as someone who is devoted to those individuals would say it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great point. Can you talk about that for a moment? These examples that you bring up here that create this problem around the assumption that if Josephus said he was the Christ, automatically that makes him a Christian. No way. That's a later insertion. Can't be.
It's important to remember that the word Christos in Greek, which we translate as the Christ, when we translate that, it has this almost exclusive religious and Christian meaning. In Greek, it didn't. In Greek, it was just a normal word. It meant smeared. It didn't have religious connotations. When we translate it as the anointed one, that still carries religious connotations. It might not be specifically Christian, but it would still carry these meanings. But in Greek, it didn't even have religious connotations. It just meant you're smeared with something. Josephus uses almost the same structure. He uses Christos ein, was smeared, to describe someone applying plaster to a wall, that it was smeared on. Then you take the fact that this word Christ, though on the one hand could be a confession of faith, Jesus is the Christ, he's the anointed one, the Messiah, the promised figure who's going to redeem God's people. But on the other hand, we know from experience that religious figures and many people will get these titles that people will often freely say, like Prophet Muhammad or His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when they don't actually necessarily have faith in a religious sense in these people. And we see examples of that in ancient literature, where we have Latin and Greek authors who are not Christians using the word Christ just as a name for Jesus. It's just to designate him. They're not, it's like how people today will say Jesus Christ, and they don't mean he's the Christ and I trust him as the Christ. In Greek, this is even more ambiguous, because in English, that phrase that you see on the screen, ha Christos outos ein, is more easily translated as he was the Christ, which feels more like a religious title. But
Yeah.
in Greek, names often have the definite article. If you and I were speaking Greek, I'd probably call you the Jacob, and you would call me the Tom. It's just how
Yeah.
it worked. So in Greek, it's squishy. And so my argument is that I think that this passage, it's a little complicated, but I think it makes sense of all the evidence. So I'm going to just lay it all out. So this particular phrase, I do think, is not what Josephus wrote. I think he wrote something like he was called the Christ, or thought to be the Christ, or something like that. But, and that's due to Latin and Syriac evidence. And there's even a Latin paraphrase we didn't mention that's also very early that suggests this as well. But having said that, it turns out that from an original Greek perspective, from a Greek readerly perspective, the altered phrase is still kind of ambiguous. That it's not entirely clear what the altered phrase is trying to say. And we see that with several authors like Eusebius, who will freely admit that Josephus was a Jew, that he was not a Christian, but yet he'll quote this passage at the same time. And to him, it's not a contradiction. It doesn't appear to be contradictory to him, what Josephus says here, and the fact that he's Jewish. And we see that with several other authors also. So what I think is that there was an alteration here. but that it actually, to us, it looks very substantive. It looks like a massive alteration, that a very important phrase was removed. But from a Greek readerly perspective, I think
Not really.
continued to read it pretty much the same way. This is just another name for Jesus, and they move on.
Yeah. Yeah, because even if one believes that Josephus wrote this whole passage the way it is, it's not, your point is, it's not definitive enough to say, okay, this is portraying him as a believer.
Correct. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And when he uses the Greek word "in" was, it's kind of like, okay, so now he's saying he was the Christ, but kind of like in the past tense too. So that could have potentially created some irritation, and there is a question related to that I'll ask you about in a little bit. But if this was added by a Christian, based on how a lot of other scholars will interpret this, why didn't that person put the Greek word estin in there? He is the Christ. Put it in the present tense.
I ask the same question in my book, that Christians, both past and present, they say Jesus is the Christ. They do not say he was the Christ, because the whole point of Christianity is that Jesus is still alive and that he exists currently. And you see this in the New Testament. You are the Christ. He is the Christ. So this is suggestive that this phrase didn't come from a Christian, and it hints at the idea that A, Josephus wrote it, but B, that whatever was dropped out, the person who was responsible for that either didn't bother to change ain to estin, or they dropped it out accidentally. They skipped the phrase or something like that. It's another clue that this alteration doesn't have seemed to be part of a systematic endeavor to Christianize this whole passage, because otherwise you would have changed that to is. If that was the only example of that, I think you could argue against what I'm saying. But again, throughout the whole passage, we see these statements about Jesus that lend themselves to negative interpretations. And if someone wanted to Christianize the passage in a systematic way, it just feels unimaginable they would have left these things behind.
Now, I want you to talk about the other use of the word Christ, like in reference to a building, because you mentioned that Josephus uses the word differently.
Yeah, so he does use it, Christos, as an adjective, or I guess a paraphrastic participle, to mean that something was smeared, and he's talking about a roof or a wall that was covered in plaster or mud or something. It was smeared with this, or was plastered. He's probably trying to say it was plastered, and that gets at that, rubbing something, some fluid-like substance onto something else, which people do all the time. They rub oil on themselves, they rub plaster on walls, they rub mud on things. So there's a rubbing, smearing aspect to it. And I highlight that. I think that's important because it shows, number one, that Josephus didn't necessarily view this term as particularly religious or Christian. He's willing to just use it in this mundane way. Number two, he expects his audience to know what it means, that it means something that's smeared, something that is rubbed on something. And what that implies is that in the Testimonium Flavianum, he wouldn't have necessarily expected his readers to understand he would have expected them to know the etymological meaning of the word, and it would have made sense to them. But he doesn't necessarily expect them to know all of the potential connotations of a Jewish Messiah and all the Old Testament stuff and the prophecies, that he's just given them enough to identify this figure Jesus. And later on in the paragraph where he talks about Jesus, he mentions, oh yeah, Christians get their name from this guy. So he's trying to just situate people in history so they know, okay, these Christians come from this guy who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And that was enough for him.
Yeah, because what you're showing here is definitely indicates that when Josephus does make use of the word Christon, Christos in other places, it's not always it's clearly not to refer to somebody as a Messiah like a Christian, because Josephus obviously doesn't think a building is a Messiah. I mean, come
Yeah, yeah,
on.
yeah,
An
yeah.
inanimate object.
One thing I'll also say is that what late first century Jewish expectations were regarding the Messiah is probably very diverse and not necessarily dividing itself along clear Jewish and Christian lines like we might find today. We have in Jewish literature, the Talmud, the Mishnah, we have discussions about the Messiah, and we have rabbis, who will say, oh, the Messiah already came. They don't think it's Jesus, but they think the Messiah may have come already. Some of them think there's two Messiahs. Some of them think also pre-messianic figures. And remember, in the Old Testament, the word anointed was used, but not exclusively of this amazing Savior, almost semi-divine or divine figure. It was used of that figure, but also it was used of the kings of Israel. It was used of other people. So what I'm trying to say here is that Josephus could have used the word mundanely. It's also very possible that Josephus it may have liked Jesus. He might have thought Jesus was a remarkable person. He just didn't think he was the anointed savior. He could have conceivably thought of him as some sort of lesser but godly figure whom the Christians distorted his teaching, and he didn't like the Christians, but he thought the original Jesus was just fine, potentially even a remarkable person who worked wonders and such and such. So those are all categories Josephus could have fallen into. We don't need to think he either had to be anti-Jesus or pro-Jesus. He could have had any range of beliefs about him.
And then you mentioned here that Josephus generally deploys words like kaluminos or epikaluminos or epilugominos, a certain Menahem, because you're trying to make this point that, like, because this is going to get into tis in a second here, and when Josephus uses a certain, why would a Christian insert that? And that is, in the way Josephus' deployment of that word and similar words connected to it are a norm for Josephus's writing style.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Do you want me to comment on that word,
Yeah.
a certain?
Yeah.
In the Testimonium Flavianum, it begins by using the Greek indefinite adjective or pronoun tis, meaning a certain. So it begins by saying, in this time there was a certain Jesus. Now in English, if someone says that, depending how they emphasize that word, it will come across to you as they're just identifying someone you're unaware of, or it'll come across as being disparaging to you in English. In Greek, the same exact dynamic is at play. And in fact, if you look up when tis in Greek dictionaries, if you look up when tis is used in conjunction with a proper name, and it's important that it's a proper name, not some other descriptor of people. When it's used with a proper name, it often carries a, quote, sense of contempt. So Josephus begins the Testimonium Flavianum with the phrase, there was a certain Jesus. And Christians seem to have not liked that phrase. They viewed it probably as offensive to them because many Greek manuscripts omit that phrase. However, Eusebius of Caesarea preserves it, and we also have it in Jacob of Edessa's Syriac translation, and we have it in a Slavonic translation, and there's a secondary Armenian witness. So we know it was there, but it was left out. And so we don't know about Latin because it's very hard for Latin to communicate indefinite articles. So the Latin translations, it's much, they can't reveal this kind of thing to us. But this gives us another clue that when Josephus is starting to talk about Jesus, he may not be about to say all positive stuff about the guy.
And when you bring up here epilegomenos, it's I just want to remind people in the audience that, and they've seen this discussed in prior episodes on my channel and elsewhere, that in the James passage you have the Greek word legomino.
Legomenos, yes.
Called Christ. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is why one of the reasons I argue that the Latin and Syriac translations go back to an original, because Josephus, as you know, he talks about Jesus one other time, but there he doesn't say he was the Christ. He says he was called the Christ. And the examples you have on the screen are instances of this, where Josephus will, when he's giving an alternative name for someone, he usually use words like kalumenos, epikalumenos, epilegomenos, or legomenos. These are all synonyms for someone who was called something. And we see with Jesus in the second reference, yes, he says legomenu, Christou, he was called the Christ. And we look at the Testimonium Flavianum, he doesn't use that, but the Syriac and the Latin show that it probably was there, or some synonym of that he's only somehow considered to be the Christ. So you have these pieces of evidence that I think are actually very persuasive, that these early translations, you have the Latin, the Syriac, you have another Latin paraphrase, and then you have the fact that Josephus uses a different way to talk about Jesus elsewhere, but it parallels the Latin and Syriac translations. So it all makes sense.
Yeah, that takes me to talk about Origen, or I don't know how to pronounce that, but the church father in the 3rd century, and this. So when some scholars had argued there's an interpolation going on, and I always found this to be quite, the logic of it to be quite suspect, is, okay, so Origen's confused, apparently. This is from their point of view. And not even the James passage is in Josephus from their point of view, at least not as we imagine it.
Mm-hmm.
There is possibly a James there, but it's not our James. And legomeno, Christo, it was added later by some other guy for some reason. Like, wow. That's kind of strange for somebody to add that in later. Called Christ. Right? What Christian would write that in there? And then some will bring up this argument, and I'm trying to remember the name of the specific scholar that brought this up. R. Joseph Hoffman he brought this up somewhere, that he thought James was the brother of Jesus ben Damnius. And say, okay, so if Jesus ben Damnius was confused with Jesus Christ, why would a Christian confuse a Jesus that was alive 30 years later, is the son of a different guy, not even having the same name as Joseph? His name is Damnius. So that's kind of funny to me. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. And then suppose that James was his brother, when nobody says this in the ancient world. That just doesn't make any sense to me.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think that the second reference to Jesus is absolutely authentic in the Antiquities. The vast majority of scholars agree as well, and they agree for many reasons. One is that particular passage doesn't seem anything like a Christian would write. James is accused of being a lawbreaker, but Josephus never vindicates that. He doesn't say, well, no, but he wasn't. He just lets the accusation stand. The death of James doesn't completely match with other descriptions of James's death. It's also placed too early. The passage calls James the brother of Jesus, and we know from early Christians like Origen that they really wanted Joseph and Mary to never have slept together, so they don't want James to be the brother of Jesus. So they actually recoil. Origen twice recoils from this passage. He quotes the passage in Josephus where James is called the brother of Jesus, and he says, actually, it would be better to use some different terminology here. And so it just feels like highly unlikely to be interpolated by a Christian. And then in order to come up with some rationale, there's a couple scholars will theorize that maybe there was, Jesus is extremely common name in the ancient world, in the ancient Jewish world. So maybe there was this other guy, Jesus ben Damnius, son of Damnius, who
Yeah.
Josephus talks about several verses later. Maybe he was the person being referred to here and all that kind of stuff. But that requires something called conjectural emendation. And conjectural emendation is when you change a text having no textual witnesses that support your change. And it's a very dangerous move because there's no textual witnesses that support it. And it's usually only carried out by scholars when the passage at hand is obviously incorrect. It's grammatically wrong or doesn't make any sense. And sometimes it's worthwhile. I mean, sometimes you look at it and you know that the word "and" is missing, so you insert the word "and." But for something like this, there's absolutely no textual witnesses that support it. It would require a Christian scribe to think that Jesus, as you said, Ben Damnius was Jesus for some reason. I mean, and that they would put this in even though they probably wouldn't have believed James was the brother of Jesus. I mean, it
Right.
is one step unlikely after another. It's improbable step after improbable step. So I don't think that theory has much credibility.
And what they're doing inadvertently by thinking like this is they are actually interpolating Josephus. They're doing the
Yes,
very thing that they're accusing
I know.
scribes of doing. It's funny.
And I hope, I mean, so I am recommending in the Testimonium Flavianum, I am recommending that the Greek version has a change, but this is based off of textual witnesses. It's based off
Right.
of, as I keep saying, the Syriac and the Latin, which is normal textual criticism. That's good textual criticism. You look at all the witnesses and you assemble the original text.
Right. We're not hypothesizing edits with no evidence for it. Yeah. We're not doing hypothetical redactions.
Mhm.
Right. But that takes me to the next thing. So Origen talks about the James passage, obviously, but he doesn't mention, it appears not to mention the testimonium Flavianum.
Mhm.
And what I want to ask you is, could it be that he found the testimonium a little irritating in some way? Could it be that why did Josephus write Jesus was the Christ there?
Hmm.
Could that have been enough or contribute to Origen deciding that I don't know what to make of this, especially since other scholars have looked at Josephus and noticed that in the Jewish wars, he seems to be applying messianic language and there's some debate about exactly how he does it, but he does it with Emperor Vespasian.
Hmm.
And in Josephus, Josephus is putting it in the past tense with Jesus. Could that
Hmm.
have been enough to irritate
Hmm.
Origen? As you know what? I think I'm going to steer clear to testimonium. I don't know what to make of this.
Hmm. I had not thought of that one point about if we
Hmm.
take that Jews had a diverse view of the Messiah. They sometimes thought the Messiah was in the past, but the Messiah looked extremely different than what Christians were expecting. Origen is famous for having a very close dialogue with contemporary Jews. He interacted with rabbis. He knows about their traditions. So that's a very very interesting point there, Jacob. That if he knows this and he's looking at the Testimonium Flavianum and he sees that Josephus says he was the Christ, Origen, knowing that this Christ language doesn't necessarily mean he's a Christian, that it actually could indicate that he thought the Messiah had come and gone, and that was kind of discomforting to him. I haven't thought about that before. That's a great one. I'm going to write that down, Jacob. You might get cited at some point in the future, but
Oh
I
wow,
I,
honored.
I think that broadly speaking, yes. The argument that people often make, they make the argument that the Testimonium Flavianum is forged or interpolated, and one of their pegs they hang this argument on is the fact that Origen doesn't cite it, even though Origen cites from Book 18 of the Antiquities right around where Jesus is supposedly mentioned. And I used to think that was a plausible argument. I thought that, well, it probably meant the Testimonium Flavianum looked really different than what we have it today, and Origen just didn't like it. But when I started examining the Testimonium Flavianum, I realized that there's enough in it already to make Origen not want to cite it. And furthermore, we have other examples of writers that we saw recently, just few minutes ago, where we saw the Paschal Chronicle and George Synkelus, they do the same thing. They quote these adjacent passages in Josephus, but they don't talk about the Testimonium Flavianum, even though we know they knew about it. So what I think is that Origen was kind of irritated by it, but not overly so. And I think one of the prime irritants was the fact that Josephus says that Jesus worked miracles. Now, this sounds nice to us. It sounds very pro-Christian to us. In Greek, not so much. In Greek, the specific word that Josephus deploys is paradoxa. And that is often, not necessarily, but often associated with sorcery and wizardry, spellcasting, incantations, stuff like that. And Origen, so in other words, it has negative connotations. And Eusebius is aware of this. He's defensive over this. Twice he says, well, I know some people think he performed paradoxa as a wizard or sorcerer, and he addresses those concerns. But Origen is responding when he quotes from these adjacent passages in Josephus. It's in a work called yeah, there we go. Yeah, paradoxos, an ambiguous term. Yeah. He's responding to a vicious anti-Christian critic named Celsus. And Celsus uses a Jewish interlocutor to accuse Jesus of performing paradoxa by the aid of Egyptian magic. So Celsus is saying, yeah, Jesus performed paradoxa by magic. So for Origen to then quote Josephus, who's saying the same thing, he performed paradoxa, obviously is not in Origen's self-interest to do that and to bring that up. So I think that as the Testimonium Flavianum stands, it is very plausible that Origen just would not have bothered to cite it, just like later Christians didn't bother to cite it either, even though they clearly knew about it.
Right. Some people will like to say that, okay, this is a problem. If Origen didn't cite it, this is very powerful negative evidence that there was no testimony of Flavianum at all. And I'm like, I feel like this is the point I was trying to make earlier, but I noticed that I think that scholars just didn't really pay attention to, is that if Josephus is already insinuating, he's already implying messianic language to Vespasian in his previous work, and then in the Antiquities, he's already using past tense language with Jesus. The combination of those things would have made Origen like, I don't know what to do with the testimonium because of that. And so with the James passage, he's not necessarily referring to Jesus in the past tense in the same way. So he's using a legamenu Christo instead.
I think now I'm having to go off my memory. I think in the James passage, he uses a present participle, but in Greek,
Right.
present participles only indicate relative time to the main verb. And I think the main verb in that passage is the past tense. So what that would mean is that Josephus' statement about Jesus, who is called Christ,
Right.
is technically ambiguous. You could translate it as it's more easy to translate he was called Christ. You could technically translate it he is the Christ, but that's not how grammatically it would normally go. But it's a little more ambiguous. So in other words, he's not clearly using the past tense there.
Right. That's kind of what I was trying to say in a different way. It's like it's more ambiguous. There's enough room there for Origen to kind of like work with it and not get too terribly upset about it.
Yeah.
Whereas with the testimonium and the stuff about and the fact that Josephus is applying messianic language of Vespasian in his prior work, that would have been a messier situation,
right,
for him to deal with. So now I want to get to the part where, let me see, page 135, we are talking about a certain Jesus. Here we go.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us a little bit more here about why you think that the testimonium originally had Jesus tis in there, a certain Jesus?
If we look at the remaining manuscripts of the Antiquities is a very large work. I think it's over 300,000 words. long. So because this was so large, it would be copied in multiple manuscripts, kind of like when we have very large books, we'll put them in separate volumes. Same thing with this. So there are many manuscripts of the antiquities in Greek that remain. But of course, we're only talking about manuscripts that have Book 18 in it that preserve this particular passage, the Testimonium Flavianum. And it turns out we only have 3 of these. We do have more, but they're later, and scholars think they're secondary. So we have 3 primary manuscripts. The earliest comes from the 10th or 11th century. This is normal textual preservation in ancient works. Usually the first time you get a substantial manuscript is 12th, 13th century, 10th century, something like that. When you look at those 3 Greek manuscripts, they don't have the word tis. They don't have Jesus tis. They just have Jesus. However, those aren't the only textual witnesses we have. We also have many Greek quotations, so other manuscripts by Greek authors who quote the testimonium. We also have other translations. And in the earliest quotation made by Eusebius of Caesarea, in the earliest manuscript of that quotation, he says, Jesus tis. And when we look at a Syriac translation of Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, that also has chad, which is the word for one or certain in Syriac. And in the Armenian translation, it is me, which is another word for one. So we know that it was there. We know Eusebius preserved that. And then we also have another Syriac translation of Jacob where it's in there. There's Slavonic evidence as well. You put it all together, and it looks like this was originally there. And this is the only other area that I think has suffered something in the transmission process. And I think that it's because scribes felt that it was negative, and it was very, very small word. I mean, you're talking about a very small minor word, but it gives this little nuance to begin the passage. Having said that, though, I think at the bottom of this paragraph, even that you have on the screen, I point out that it's not necessarily negative. There are instances where Josephus and others will use it in just a purely neutral way. And so it's not inherently negative, but it certainly lends itself to negative aspect. And I think that there were some scribes that didn't like that. They were offended by it, and so they let that little tiny word, 3 letters, drop out. This is the 3rd area where I think there might have been some textual changes. But unlike the previous, I mentioned there was only 2. This one doesn't really count. And it doesn't count for a few reasons. One is that whether the original was eis eti tenun or the eti was omitted, so it's just eis tenun, those are effectively totally synonymous phrases. But more importantly, eis tenun is what the 2 earliest manuscripts of the antiquities contain, and the 3rd earliest and primary manuscript has something different. I think it's eis te kai or something. It's not eis eti tenun, which is again totally synonymous a phrase. The reason why some scholars have read eis eti tenun is because that's actually how Eusebius quotes the passage. And when the text of Josephus was being assembled, they took Eusebius's quotation as the accurate reading and they put it into the text. But I show that when you look at how Josephus uses language, I think the Antiquities manuscripts lacking the eti are much more plausible.
So now I want to ask you about the Slavonic recension. So what exactly, it's been discussed on my channel before, but remind the audience, what exactly is the Slavonic Josephus, and how does the testimonium Slavonium contribute to this discussion?
Josephus wrote many works. The Antiquities is one of them. His more famous work, though, was the Jewish War. And that was the one that had more circulation It covered, the years of 67 to 70 AD. It actually went or even earlier than that, but its focus was on, 67 through 70. And it was translated into Syriac. It was translated into Latin. There were paraphrases of it also that were made. And then it also, in the medieval times, received oh, you got it. Wow,
I
that's an
do.
expensive one, Jacob. Yeah.
Yep.
In medieval times, it also received this sort of complete reworking by a Slavonic author. This also happened in Latin. Pseudo-Hegesippus did the same thing in Latin, where he took the work of Josephus and then completely reworked it, inserting Christian things. The same thing happened with the Slavonic version of the Jewish War. But there's some interesting things, though. One is that it has this very expanded passage on Jesus where he almost looks like a rebel. The other issue with it is that it's weird. It seems to have all of these Jewish. In other words, it doesn't look like your typical medieval scribe did this, and that has led a minority, like Eisler was the most famous, to think that actually the Slavonic was translated off of a Hebrew version, not a Greek version, a Hebrew or Aramaic version of the Jewish War, because Josephus tells us that he actually wrote the Jewish War in Hebrew or Aramaic and then translated it into Greek, and we only have the Greek remaining. And so the argument is that this comes from the Hebrew or Aramaic original. And so what we have here is not Christian interpolations. It's actually Josephus's own variations. And he said some other things here about Jesus that we don't find in the Greek. Fascinating hypothesis. Most scholars, they knee-jerk dismiss that out of hand. I love these kind of hypotheses. I think that this is the bread and butter of history. This is what makes history interesting. It's of course possible that happened. It's possible that it happened.
What helps his case, sorry if I interrupted what you were saying, but I just wanted to jump in to say a couple fast things real quick. Is the first thing is that the Slavonic Josephus is missing the preface. So the Slavonic Josephus does not mention that there was a previous work written in a different language, whereas the standard Greek Jewish wars does. So that's a point for Eisler's position. And the second thing is the Slavonic Josephus has Jesus appearing to Pilate twice. The first time he's released, the second time he's recaptured and killed, which kind of, not more than kind of, fits the idea that Barabbas and Jesus, that some scholars think, were originally the same person. So if you imagine this representing an older tradition, then it does look like the Barabbas and Jesus could be interpreted as the same person, because it's the same guy. He got released, then captured again, and then crucified. I just want to throw that in there real quick.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't think I'd go quite that far. I wouldn't go that far, but there are fascinating theories about it. And one of the issues is if you line up the changes between the Greek version and the Slavonic version, they don't look like something a medieval Christian scribe or even an ancient Christian scribe would have made. And this has caused a lot of controversy. Then where did these come from? I subscribe to the idea that what's going on here is, if we look at, the ancient Eastern Europe, where these Slavonic manuscripts are coming out of, there actually was a very active literary Jewish community. We know that these Eastern Jewish communities have these traditions about Jesus, and that sometimes are quite extensive, like the Toldoth Yeshu, for instance, is percolating throughout Jewish communities at this time, which is this hostile biography of Jesus. So I think the best explanation is that this Slavonic recension was done by a medieval person, but they were a Jewish kind of Christian person. They were a Jewish person who was interested in Christianity. And that would explain why they're not fitting neatly in one or the other category.
Yeah.
Having said that, though, personally, I would love it if we found out that the Slavonic actually comes from a Hebrew or Aramaic version of Josephus. I think that'd be fascinating. I think it's unlikely because it would require this Hebrew or Aramaic text, which would be very lengthy. It would require it to be preserved and passed through generations without any whisper or knowledge of it in the vast Talmudic. We're talking thousands of pages of Talmudic literature in the Mishnah and the Tosefta, that without Christians talking about it, Christians are aware of Jewish traditions. They
Hmm.
talk about these things. And so it gets back to one of those, that particular argument I'm making is, it's an argument from silence, but as we know, those arguments have different power depending on the expectation level of something being mentioned.
Right.
So uh, I, I think it'd be really cool if it actually went back to Josephus, but I think it's unlikely.
Is it possible that, because I've wondered this, like could the Slavonic scribes have discovered a lost manuscript of Josephus, and that's why it was not discussed throughout the interim,
I
and the Slavonic Josephus was the result of that.
Right. We know in ancient history that just like today, where an archaeologist or a historian or someone will stumble across an ancient book or text or scroll or papyrus fragment, the same thing did happen in the ancient and medieval world. We have several examples of this. We know that this could happen. There's an example, let's see, of in Syriac tradition, there's this story of people finding some lost psalms, and they apparently this actually happened, and these actually were some additional psalms that are not in the Hebrew, the traditional Hebrew Bible, and they found it hundreds and hundreds of years later. Origen talks about how he found a Greek translation of, I forget which Old Testament book, but he found it in a jar in Jericho. And we have other instances of this. Jerome will talk about, no, excuse me, Eusebius talks about having, Origen's handwriting. And I guess that's not much of a discovery, but we know that manuscripts could be passed down and survive quite some time. So it's possible. It would be unlikely, and I would want to see more evidence. I'd want to see more evidence of it.
So now I want to ask you about the negative, neutral, and positive translations. I'm going to let me zoom out a little bit here. There we go.
These I offer in chapter 4, and I'm discussing about how to properly understand the Testimonium Flavianum. And the issue, as with all language, is that it's impossible for English to precisely match the subtle nuances of the Greek. So what I do here is I offer 3 different possible ways to translate the passage, and I highlight the differences in bold. And
Yeah.
these differences could be swapped back and forth. It's not that the negative only stays negative. I mean, you could put a negative thing in the positive version as well. The positive version follows the traditional translation of the Testimonium Flavianum, except with the one difference is that it does use the word certain, a certain Jesus. But the neutral and negative versions highlight the potential ways that the passage could be understood. I argue that Josephus would have meant something more like the neutral way, with some ambiguity that could lend some negativity or even a little bit of positivity. And so perhaps I can just walk through the bold changes so
Yeah.
you can see that. So you start at the top and you see that term certain Jesus, which actually, as we discussed, could carry this negative connotation right at the beginning. And then he says he was a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. Now, right away, that feels positive. Is he implying that Jesus is divine? I argue that actually he could be suggesting he's less than human, not more than human. And the reason why is because of the very next verse where he explains this. He says, "For he was a doer of," and here is where so much turns. He's a doer of paradoxa. And how you translate that is going to affect the whole passage. Because if you say miracles, then all of a sudden the whole passage becomes very positive. But if you say incredible deeds, which is what I put in the neutral translation, you kind of scratch your head a little bit, because what does he mean by incredible? Something that's amazing? Or does he mean something that maybe isn't worthy of your belief? In Greek, this ambiguity is more along moral lines. Where is the source of this power coming from? And that's what I do in the negative version. I say he was a doer of magical deeds, which, of course, from a Judeo-Christian perspective, is very, very negative. And that flips the whole passage, so that if one indeed ought to call him a man, as this guy who's up to stuff he shouldn't be. And he does have this supernatural power, but it's not from the divine. It's from the demonic or from other sources. And then you go down, and it talks about how Jesus was a teacher of men who take pleasure in truth. That's how it's often translated. We didn't mention this, but very briefly, the word truth isn't actually what is in the passage. It's this plural crassus. It's kind of like a slang plural word for truth. So it's not nearly as profound. So you could say receive truths, but you could also, when you factor in that word pleasure, that phrase receive with pleasure is used by Josephus several times, usually in a negative way. Usually he says receive with pleasure to indicate this unconstrained appetite, this naivety, this being overly zealous. So you combine all that together, and negatively I say who take pleasure in truisms. That sounds negative to us, probably. The actual nuance in Greek would be negative, but in a slightly different way. Again, it's just very hard to capture. Then, second paragraph, he led many from among the Jews, sounds normal. Or you could say the neutral one, he brought over many from among the Jews and Greeks. All of a sudden, in the context of Jewish uprisings, which is where this passage is situated, it seems like Josephus is calling Jesus maybe an insurrectionist. He's bringing over all these people. And then negatively, you could viably translate that term as he led astray, or he induced multiple people. So you can see, if you follow the negative pathways, the passage becomes quite negative. And my argument is not that Josephus meant that. I think it's one way of interpreting it, but I do think he did make a neutral. He was crafting a neutral statement, perhaps one that was a little negative or a little positive, but much more in the neutral side of things. And then in the bottom of the second paragraph, you could say negatively he was thought to be the Christ, or neutrally he was believed to be the Christ, or if you want to go with that other reading, he was Christ or he was the Christ, but interpreting it as a name, not as a confession of faith. And then moving down, he talks about those who loved him at first. And that sounds positive to us, like he's complimenting the disciples of Jesus. But Josephus loves the word love. He uses it all the time in very mundane ways. He'll talk about people didn't love what was done to the water. They love, it's just a term of attraction. It's much more neutral. So I say we're devoted to him. And then the last significant change is a big one. And this is where it's often translated that Jesus appeared to the disciples alive again in fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. It sounds like the positive rendering is claiming that Josephus believed that Jesus was resurrected, but in Greek, not so clear. The Greek word you can very viably translate as he appeared, or he seemed to them to be alive. He appeared to them to be alive. This would cast this assertion in the mind of the disciples, and Josephus is simply reporting what happened, or what they think happened. He's reporting their thoughts. He's not reporting what actually happened. And I show in my book that this same grammatical construction with the same words is used by Josephus to mean seem, not actually appear. So you put that all together, if you follow the negative or neutral renderings, this looks totally Josephine. There's nothing about it that should cause suspicion. The style is Josephine. The claims look like a first century Jewish author. There's nothing about it. It also explains the reception history of the passage. Why are there so many people who quote from it, but then don't point out all these fantastic things? Why are there people that don't quote from it, even though they know about it? And yet, why do we have a few authors who do find these positive things in it? And the answer is because, well, it was a pretty neutral, ambiguous passage that if you really wanted to wrench it, you could make it positive, but clearly it's meant to be neutral or negative.
If you have a preference, which one of these three would you prefer over the other?
That's a great question. I find myself differing. My anchor, my orbit is always around the neutral passage, but sometimes I do lean slightly more negative. Sometimes I lean slightly more positive. It depends on what you think Josephus's attitude was towards the disciples or the early Christians versus towards Jesus himself. So if you think he's erring on the side of positivity, then he probably kind of liked Jesus, but doesn't believe everything Christians are saying about him and doesn't like Christians all that much. If you lean a little bit towards the negativity, then he probably isn't willing to come out and say that Jesus was this horrible false prophet and did all sorts of terrible stuff, but doesn't probably think too much of him and doesn't like Christians all that much either.
So we have a super chat question from Piotr Kukarski. I hope I pronounced that name right. It seems that ending of the second one would fit better with the beginning of the fourth. Testimonium Flavianum feels like a strange insertion that breaks up the narrative. Are there any other examples of such practices in his books?
I think, Piotr, when you say section 2, are you saying the which section? I'm not entirely clear what section you're referring to. If it's the antiquities or if it's
the super chat came in when we were going over these three different.
Okay. What I can say, Piotr, is that Josephus is notorious for being a patchwork writer. Scholars have talked about this. He does pastiches. He takes pieces of things and fits them together. And so the fact that if it appears a little awkward, that's actually very Josephine. He does stuff like that.
He's expanding on what he said. He says here, and thus an end was put to this sedition.
Okay.
And then he wrote, about the same time also another side community.
I see. Yeah, okay. Yes.
That's what he's talking about.
Yes. Okay. I understand you now. Scholars have argued that the Testimonium Flavianum feels out of place in the antiquities, just like you're saying, Piotr. And my response to that is twofold. One is what I just said, that that's what Josephus does. He likes that kind of stuff. He does that quite a bit. But secondly, my observation is to say that I don't think it actually is out of place. I think it makes very good sense and reads very fluidly within the context of Josephus's overall book that he's writing about the reign or governorship of Pontius Pilate. And that's because what he does, he's talking about Pontius Pilate. So of course, mentioning Jesus makes sense. He's listing various uproars that have gone on. And he has just spoken about 2 of them where Pontius Pilate was interacting with the Jewish people and Pontius Pilate is hunting them down or doing bad things to them. And then he then comes to Jesus, and it's very easy to read this passage as talking about Jesus leading an uprising. He is this certain Jesus who's bringing over many Jews and Greeks. He's accused by the Jewish leaders. He's executed, crucified by Pontius Pilate, and crucifixion in the Roman world was usually done for insurrectionists. So it's very plausible to read this as an insurrection or uproar. However, even if we don't want to read it that way, if you go to the next story of uproar, it has nothing to do with hordes of people in rebellion against Roman authorities. It's this salacious story about this beautiful woman who's not even Jewish. She's not even living in Jerusalem or Judea. She's living in Rome. She's this beautiful married woman. Some other guy falls in love with her, wants to sleep with her. She won't let him. She's a devotee of Anubis, this god. So the guy goes and bribes the temple of Anubis to let him pretend to be Anubis in order to trick this woman to sleep with her for one night, which he does. That's the story. It has nothing to do with Pontius Pilate, nothing to do with Jews, nothing to do with seditions. It's just this salacious story. And the story of Jesus fits a lot better in context than that one. And I think actually that when you understand Jewish traditions about Jesus, the Jewish traditions will say that Mary was deceived by this guy. He fell in love with her because of her beauty, and he pretended to be her fiance to sleep with her for one night, which sounds a whole lot like this other salacious story of this guy falling in love with a beautiful woman, deceiving her to sleep with her for one night. So it makes sense that Josephus would have combined these stories back to back.
Piotr says this makes sense. Thank you. So now I'm going to go back to the book real quick and look at one more thing. You mentioned that you connect Josephus to the eyewitnesses, since you mentioned that he could have had sources that knew Jesus because there we go. Because he was born in Jerusalem. Can you expand on this?
One of my observations is that he mentions that it was the first men, the protoi, who accused Jesus before Pontius Pilate. And it's one of those times, I've read the Testimony of Flavianum hundreds and hundreds of times in Greek, in Latin, in Syriac, in Arabic, in Armenian. And I was looking at it and something jumped out at me, that word first men, it triggered something. And I felt like Josephus used that term elsewhere. It turns out that he does use it elsewhere. In 51 or 52 AD, he tells us in his autobiography that he began constantly meeting with the protoi of Jerusalem, the first men of Jerusalem. And he repeats this claim several times over the next 20 years, where it's very clear that he knew the first men of Jerusalem. So logically speaking, according to Josephus, the first men accused Jesus. 30 years later, Josephus knows the first men of Jerusalem. It's obviously possible that he could have known individuals who were involved in the trial of Jesus. That's not far-fetched. We know from Josephus's background that he was an aristocrat. He was born into an eminent priestly family, descended from high priests. He was a priest. We know that he also was descended from royalty. He knew the leader of the Sanhedrin. He became a Pharisee himself. He knew various chief priests. He knew the chief priest. He knew kings. He met with the emperor. He met with the empress. He knew the emperor. He knew more than one emperor. He was enormously well connected. So obviously, he's someone who could have known the first men of Jerusalem, and he says he does know them. So that brings up this possibility that he actually knew people who knew Jesus, and not just knew Jesus, but were his enemies and accused him. And there's some other lines of evidence that I use to demonstrate this, one other line in particular. But what I do in book 6 is I try to figure out who these people might have been. Who's he talking about? Can we actually name them? And I come up with about 10 or 11 possible candidates whom he may have had in mind. And these are not all of equal likelihood. Some of them are actually a little unlikely, but others I think are very likely or even definite. And the most plausible, the most likely is the commander, his own commander in the Jewish war. Josephus was appointed as one of 7 generals in the Jewish war. He was stationed in Galilee. And this position was enormously powerful. This was not just a military position, it was also a political position. So he's the ruler of Galilee. And he has only 2 people ahead of him. The joint supreme command were carried out by 2 individuals. One is Ananas II. The second guy falls out of the scene somehow. It's not explained, but Ananas II is the guy in power. And Ananas II, in other words, is Josephus's direct commander. And Ananas II is a former high priest. Ananas II is the one who had James, the brother of Jesus, executed. So he's already involved in the early Jesus movement, but as an opponent to it. And it turns out that Ananas II, that his brother-in-law was Caiaphas, the high priest, who in the Gospels supervises the trial of Jesus. Ananas II's father is Annas the high priest, who is high priest emeritus, as both Josephus and the New Testament say. He's not actually high priest, but he's the former high priest with enormous power who also presides over the trial of Jesus. So Josephus's commander is the brother-in-law and son of the 2 individuals responsible for accusing Jesus before Pontius Pilate and supervising the Jewish portion, the Sanhedrin portion of the trial. That gives a very close connection between Josephus and Jesus. And there's other connections as well. He knows the leader of the Sanhedrin named Simon, and Simon's father was also the leader of the Sanhedrin. His name was Gamaliel, and Gamaliel was the head of the Sanhedrin when Jesus was tried by the Sanhedrin and then sent off to Pontius Pilate. And there's several other connections as well. So clearly, Josephus could be very, very well informed about Jesus and be well informed from Jesus's enemies, not from what other Christians were saying about Jesus. And in my book, to kind of tie this up, I show that Josephus's commander, Ananas II, was extremely old. Josephus says 3 times he was very old. He actually says twice that he was the oldest of the chief priests in 68, 69 AD. So this means that this man would have been in his late 60s, probably 70s or 80s. He would have been in his 30s when Jesus was crucified. And that means that he would have been an adult. His father was high priest. His brother-in-law was high priest. He was going to be high priest. One of his other brothers had already been high priest. 3 of his brothers would become high priests. This guy is part of the strongest family, the most famous family, most influential family in Judea. And to see if we can place Josephus's commander at the trial of Jesus feels at first glance impossible. It feels like just simple speculation. Maybe he was there. He was 30 years old. His dad, supervised the trial. His brother-in-law also was there. But there is a piece of evidence that I think makes this a plausible or likely conclusion. And that's because we know from the Gospels, we also know from Jewish sources, that Jesus was executed over Passover. Passover was a pilgrimage feast. All Jews were expected to show up in Jerusalem, and they were expected to eat a Passover lamb in the house of their father. This is in accordance with Old Testament law. It's in accordance with Jewish tradition in the Mishnah, Tosefta, Talmud. What this means is that Josephus's commander, who was from Jerusalem anyway, it means he would have been in Jerusalem on the Passover. He would have been in the house of his father eating the Passover lamb. And that evening, the Gospels tell us Jesus was brought to his father's house. And the stipulations in Jewish law were that you not only had to eat the Passover lamb, you had to stay the night in the house. So it's very easy to triangulate Josephus's commander as being in his father's house on the Passover, the commander's father's house, and Jesus being brought there. In other words, when Josephus says that it was the first men among us, I don't think I covered that term, but he says the first men among us, he is indicating that he knew these people. He knew some of these people, and the most plausible candidate would be his own commander, whose father and brother supervised the trial of Jesus, and his own commander would have had to have been at that trial according to Jewish law.
Can you expand more on Ananas II? Is that could that potentially link to the biblical Annas in some sort of way, potentially?
Yes,
Like, what expand on
absolutely.
that, please.
Absolutely. Ancient Greek writing practices, they didn't have standard orthography, they didn't have standard ways of spelling. So, in the Gospel of John, Annas is the high priest emeritus. Annas is also in the Gospel of Luke. He's high priest emeritus. He's not the actual high priest, but he's the power behind the priestly throne, so to speak. His son-in-law, Caiaphas, is current high priest. In Josephus, he spells that name Ananas, which just adds an extra alpha in there. And he says Ananas. And he tells us that Ananas had 5 sons and that all 5 went on to become high priest. One of these is Ananas II. He's the junior son, the youngest son, apparently. And he becomes high priest in 62 AD. And Josephus tells us that he didn't last very long as high priest. Why? Because he had James, the brother of Jesus, illegally executed. And this infuriated the Roman governor, and the current king at the time had the Ananas II defrocked and put another high priest in his place. Josephus then tells us that Ananas II, some years later, was appointed one of the supreme commanders during the Jewish war, and that Josephus was under him as one of the 7 generals. So what we have here is Josephus's relationship to this illustrious family, the most powerful priestly family in Jerusalem, hands down. And not only that, this is the family that had Jesus executed. It's also the family. His own commander is the very guy who put Jesus's brother on trial and had him executed. And we know this because Josephus tells us this. So what it means is that for Ananas II, the Christians were very important opponents. That it's not like Ananas II is some mob boss who's ordering hits on people left and right, and then years later he wouldn't really remember exactly what happened when he ordered someone to be killed. No, Josephus tells us that he illegally convened the entire Sanhedrin to bring James, the brother of Jesus, to trial. He had him executed, and this specifically caused him to lose the high priesthood. So he was willing to risk his high priesthood to have James, the brother of Jesus, executed. And then he, in fact, did lose it. All this means is that Ananas, Josephus's commander, would have known a lot about early Christians and about Jesus. And this means that Josephus would have had remarkable access to information about Jesus from non-Christian sources, from the enemies of Jesus himself. It's actually, in my opinion, it's hard to imagine a better source than Josephus.
So, what became of Ananas II? Was he killed? But was he killed later on? But because Josephus mentions that there was an Ananas and there was a Jesus, son of Gamala, who were kind of like
Yep.
together, and they were trying to
Yes.
tell people, "Hey, surrender, guys." This was around
Yes.
80, 68, I think. It's like,
Yeah.
guys, you gotta surrender, stop fighting, we're gonna lose, and they whacked him over that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yes. He was one of the final commanders of the Jewish army when it's being surrounded by the Romans in Jerusalem, and he's trying to plead with the people, and they're not listening to him, and he ends up being killed. So he's killed 68, 69 AD. Josephus gives this very laudatory commendation of Ananas II. He's extremely complimentary of him. The irony of this is that later on, when he writes his autobiography, which is about almost 20 years later after he first talks about Ananas II in his Jewish war, 20 years later, he has a very different opinion of Ananas II. And he tells us that Ananas II actually betrayed Josephus and tried to get him arrested. and that this betrayal happened because Ananas II succumbed to bribes. And scholars have wondered, why didn't he mention this when he wrote the Jewish War? And the answer seems to be that it's not that he was unaware of it and found it out later. It's that when he wrote the Jewish War, this is only 4 to 5 years after Ananas II was dead. And he is trying to rehabilitate Judaism in the eyes of the Romans. So, number one, he doesn't want to besmirch this leader whom everybody thinks is so wonderful, even though he knows the guy's a scumbag and tried to betray him and accepted bribes. He doesn't want to make that public. It's only been 5 years since the guy died. So, better not to mention that. Secondly, he doesn't want to divide the Jewish people. He wants them to be united in this crisis where they've just been horribly defeated by the Romans. But 20 years later, these issues aren't nearly as pressing. And he also is forced to, I believe, go into some details because he also 20 years later is responding to a different writer, Justus of Tiberias, who is also writing a history where he's accusing Josephus of doing various bad things. So Josephus has to defend himself. And part of defending himself is explaining about this betrayal and so forth. So it makes for fascinating history.
So, do you think that Josephus received this information about Jesus from these guys like Ananas II and others totally in totality, or did he receive it from text or both? What do you think?
I think certainly he must have gotten information from people who knew Jesus. His father was a priest in Jerusalem on the Passover when Jesus was crucified. His father would have been in the city as a priest. This is a public act. Josephus was stationed in Galilee, where he went to Capernaum, which was Jesus's home base of ministry. He lived 3 miles down the road from Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. He went to Cana, where Jesus visited. He went to Tiberias. He went to Magdala, where Mary Magdalene was from. He went to Joppa, where Peter ministered.
That's a good point.
Of course, he grew up in Jerusalem in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So he would have had access to all sorts of people, both high and low, who had interacted or had good knowledge of Jesus. So I think certainly he's getting his information from eyewitnesses. I wouldn't discount the possibility that he's getting it from written sources, but he wouldn't have needed to do that. I mean, he wrote a 90-word paragraph that gives the outlines of Jesus's life. So he wouldn't have needed to rely on something like that. He could have, but I certainly think he was also relying on individuals on the ground.
Solara Knight, thank you for your super chat. Josephus on Jerusalem's fall. Reports some people heeded Yeshua's warning and fled in the city. 1 million Judeans died, yet most followers of Yeshua, the 144,000, were saved.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think what this is referring to is maybe there was a prophet who was warning about the impending downfall of
Jesus ben
Jerusalem.
Ananas.
Jesus ben Ananas. Okay. And either way, yes, some I think clearly fled. I mean, I don't think all 1 million people were killed. We know from Josephus that there were people who survived. He talks about rescuing some people. And there's also a Christian tradition. It's a very ancient Christian tradition that goes back to, I think, at least probably the 2nd century, that talks about these Jewish Christians are in Jerusalem and they flee to Pella and they end up flourishing there. There's actually a writer, Aristo of Pella. So I think definitely some did escape. I don't think all of them were annihilated or anything like that. And like I said, Josephus tells us that there were people who survived.
Have you looked into the relationship at all between the road to Emmaus and the testimonium Flavianum, Luke's gospel and Josephus? What is your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, Goldberg, he's a scholar, a published scholar who talks about that. I address it in the book. The argument
I've
that
had him on my
Goldberg
channel,
makes-
by the way.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
keep going.
Cool. Yeah, the argument that he makes is that the Testimonium Flavianum shares a lot of similarities between Luke's account of the appearance of Jesus on the way to Emmaus, which is this resurrection appearance of Jesus. And it also contains like a summary where the people who are walking on the road give this brief outline of Jesus's life. And what he does is claim that he thinks that Josephus is using Luke as a source for that. It's a curious claim because there's other scholars that will claim the opposite. They'll claim that Luke used Josephus for his work. And then of course there's people who think that they just weren't even using one another. I don't think Josephus was relying on Luke, and I don't think that for several reasons. One is that we know that Josephus did use written documents. Sometimes we have those documents still. And when we look at those documents, it's clear that he will borrow whole language wholesale, clauses, things like that. Those aren't the similarities we see between the Emmaus account and Josephus. So that's one reason to think he wasn't using it. Another reason is that Josephus says some things that contradict Luke, that if he was using Luke, he wouldn't have said. So he puts Jesus before John the Baptist when Luke is very, very emphatic that Jesus preached after John the Baptist. Josephus is very explicit. He says that after the crucifixion of Jesus, he says those who were first devoted to him did not cease. They didn't give up. But of course, the Luke and the other Gospels describe the disciples as fleeing when Jesus is arrested. Judas actually betrays Jesus. One of the disciples betrays Jesus. And according to Luke, the disciples refuse to believe that he's been raised to life. And so again, that doesn't look like Josephus is using Luke. He also says that Josephus says that Jesus had many Greek disciples. Luke never says that. Luke does talk about some Gentiles, but clearly this is a Jewish phenomenon in Luke. Again, that doesn't seem like it's coming from Luke. So you add all that together, and it seems implausible to me. Regarding the points of contact, so Goldberg will argue, okay, still there's a lot of points of contact between the Testimonium Flavianum and the Emmaus account. And there's way more points of contact between the Emmaus account and the Testimonium Flavianum than there is between the Testimonium Flavianum and other accounts about Jesus given in the New Testament. And my response to that would be to say, yes, but I think what I said still stands, my previous arguments, but also some of those points of contact are pretty vague. And then, how many ways can you summarize the outlines of Jesus's life? There's only so many ways. And it doesn't seem that unlikely to me that if a first or second century person was going to give an outline of Jesus's life, that they would hit upon a lot of the same themes that some other outline does. It's not enough for me to think that there's borrowing. Here's one final reason, and that's that if you trace out the social network of Josephus and you trace out the social network of Luke, they interacted with the same people, because Luke presents himself in the book of Acts. This is part of the famous we passages where all of a sudden Acts is third person, third person, third person. And then it starts into these we passages, and scholars debate about what that means. I think the most obvious way to interpret that is that this is when the author was actually present. And if we interpret it that way, then Luke is present at the trial of the Apostle Paul before Agrippa II. Luke would be there. That's interesting because Josephus's friend was Agrippa II. They exchanged 62 letters. Agrippa calls him my dearest friend, Josephus. Agrippa says in one of the letters that remains, he says to Josephus, when you come and visit me, I will make known to you matters which are not generally known by people. So if you really wanted to push these here's another link. Josephus's commander, as I mentioned, had James, the brother of Jesus, crucified, stoned to death, executed. Those we passages in Acts also take place when the author meets with James. So you have another set of triangulations possible. So I think that if you really want to push it, which I wouldn't, I don't think the evidence is sufficient to push it. But if you really want to push a relationship, you can explain it through simple social connections, not through literary connections.
Now, what do you make of the reverse idea that Luke acts as knowing Josephus as copying from him, as opposed to the reverse?
Yes, several scholars have posited that. I know that Steve Mason, for instance, posits that, and he points out lots of similarities between Josephus and Luke. I don't think that is what's going on. And the reason why is because there's also differences between them. There's differences that if Luke was using Josephus, I don't think would actually be there. There's some differences in the dating of the census of Quirinius, and it either seems like Josephus is wrong, or it seems like Luke is wrong, or it could be that Quirinius was a governor more than once. There actually is some evidence of that, but either way, Josephus doesn't say that. Another instance is Theudas. Theudas is this character, this insurrectionist, whom both Luke and Josephus mention, but they mention them with a different chronology. And that, again, doesn't seem like Luke would be using Josephus if that was the case. So I think it's unlikely. I also think Luke wrote before Josephus. I mean, if you look at Acts, the book of Acts, everyone admits that Acts is the sequel to Luke. So Luke must have been written before Acts. And if you look at Acts, the three main characters in Acts are Paul, Peter, and James. And there is not a hint that any of those three folks are going to be executed or will suffer martyrdom. And we know from Josephus that James did in 62 AD. We know from other sources, other early sources say that Paul and Peter did shortly thereafter, even at around the same time. And there's also the fact that Josephus talks at length about the statue of Caligula that was going to be placed in the Jewish temple, how it almost single-handedly caused this massive rebellion. Josephus talks about this at length. This was an enormous crisis where the Jews were going to be forced to commit idolatry in their very own temple. And Luke never mentions this. He never discusses it. It would be strange if Luke used Josephus. It also would be strange for him not to mention it if he had written after the fact. And so I think that Luke is writing too early to have used Josephus. That's it. So that's my final reason.
So I think we'll go ahead and close there. And I want to remind everybody to link to purchase the book if you want to purchase it is in the description below. And the link to get the free PDF copy of it is also in the description below. Both will be in the pinned comment. All the relevant links will be in the description as well. And that being said, Tom, thank you very much for joining me today.
Jacob, thank you too.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.